They called him a war hero. Across the stars, his name meant victory. General Zalker of the Vierin Dominion, undefeated, feared, and idolized. His very presence on the battlefield turned chaos into order, despair into discipline. His strategies had brought empires to their knees. But when asked what enemy had made him question everything, he never said the name of a rival empire. He said only one word: humans. The galaxy laughed when they first met Earth's children, a backwater species with crude ships and noisy languages. Their skin was soft, their lifespans pitiful, and their technology 10 generations behind. The Galactic Council labeled them observational primitives and dismissed them as a non-threat. But Zalker had learned that underestimation was a form of blindness. It began with a minor incident, one that should have been forgotten. A routine Vierin patrol intercepted a human scout ship that had strayed into restricted space. The humans refused to comply. No weapons charged, no evasive maneuvers, just a single transmission. We will not be taken. Minutes later, the ship detonated, vaporizing itself and crippling 2 Vierin vessels in a blast. A suicide maneuver. No other species had ever chosen oblivion over capture. The Council reviewed the incident and dismissed it as primitive recklessness. Zalker disagreed. He studied the data. The self-destruction wasn't spontaneous panic. It was executed with precision. The humans had understood their odds and had calculated their defiance. It wasn't madness. It was a message. He began reading human transmissions, sifting through intercepted broadcasts, listening to everything from war songs to morning rituals. What he saw disturbed him. They didn't fear death the way other species did. They respected it, but they did not obey it. Soon after, tensions rose. A human mining fleet retaliated against a corporate outpost on Titan, claiming illegal occupation. When the Council ordered sanctions, Earth responded by tripling its fleet patrols. Their message was clear: we are not yours to control. The Vierin Dominion was chosen to carry out a direct intervention. It was meant to be surgical. Quick, decisive. Zalker was given full command. He was told to pacify Earth. He had led 1,000 such missions. Yet this time, something gnawed at him. He remembered that first transmission, the certainty, the finality. When the Vierin fleet arrived in Sol System, Earth did not beg, did not surrender, did not stall for time. They fortified their orbit and opened fire. No warning, no negotiation. They knew they couldn't win, and still they struck first. The Dominion's technological superiority was overwhelming. Human ships were outgunned, outmatched, and outmaneuvered. On paper, Earth should have fallen in 72 hours. Zalker had even prepared a speech announcing the swift and civilized neutralization of a rogue world. But Earth refused to play by the rules. Within the first week, Vierin command centers were being hit by attacks they couldn't trace. Human stealth units, using old orbital debris fields as cover, began targeting supply lines. Civilian radio frequencies broadcast misleading troop positions. Every day, Dominion losses grew, not in mass battles, but in dozens of small, inexplicable disappearances. Dropships went dark. Forward posts went silent. Entire squads vanished without a trace. Then came the night of the Black Moon. A signal was received from Lunar Base 9, announcing a human surrender. The base opened its gates. Vierin units entered without resistance. And then the moon shook. A series of synchronized fusion detonations tore the facility apart. A third of the fleet station above was destroyed in the shockwave. Those that survived limped back to orbit, only to be met by human ships rising from the planet like wasps from a shattered hive. Zalker, wounded in the aftermath, listened in silence to the reports. He had studied hundreds of species. He had memorized their tactical tendencies. But nothing in his vast archive matched this. The humans fought with fury, yes, but it was controlled, measured. They didn't lash out in panic. They engineered their rage into strategies. They made traps not to win, but to ensure that if they lost, they would take the enemy with them. The concept of mutual annihilation wasn't a last resort. It was an option deliberately chosen. As the Vierin reeled, the Council insisted the humans were simply cornered animals. But Zalker no longer believed that. He reviewed every intercepted human transmission again, not just for intel, but for intent. They weren't driven by conquest, nor survival alone. They fought because they had chosen to, not to expand their empire, but to protect their right to exist without chains. He saw it in their war songs, in the messages from mothers to sons, in soldiers' last words. We will not bow, not because we hate you, but because we refuse to be less than what we are. This was no savage uprising. It was a declaration. Zalker stood before the council once again, asking them to halt the campaign. He warned that humans would not be broken like the others. They could not be terrified into submission. But the council, proud and blind, ignored him. The VA Ren launched a second offensive. Zalker stayed behind, recovering, but he read every report, each one more disturbing than the last. Human resistance had only intensified. They used ocean trenches, abandoned stations, even their own wounded as bait. They hacked alien code, hijacked Dominion drones, and rewired alien weapons mid-battle. A species with no psychic link, no telepathy, no high coordination, and yet they outmaneuvered the greatest military machine in the known galaxy. Zalker realized something no one else had yet grasped. The humans were not fighting to win. They were fighting to teach a lesson written in fire, in silence, in blood. We are not weak because we feel. We are strong because we do. And he, the great general, began to feel something he had never felt before. Not on the battlefield, not in council chambers, not even at death's door. He felt fear. Earth's orbit was a graveyard. VA command ships drifted like broken statues. Blackened hulls floated beside vapor trails. The second invasion was meant to be overwhelming. Double the ships, enhanced drones, tactical AI support. Yet, nothing had gone as predicted. Human resistance wasn't just persistent. It was surgical, adaptive, and mercilessly clever. From the first hour of re-entry, something felt wrong. Human defenses were oddly positioned, leaving wide gaps. Dominion tacticians called it sloppy. Zalker, watching from afar, saw it for what it was, a trap. The humans weren't planning to stop the invasion. They were planning to dismantle it from the inside. Within the first 24 hours, VA ground forces were funneled into narrow city corridors. Automated drones disguised as rubble exploded in waves. Entire platoons were sealed inside false buildings designed to collapse inward. Surveillance feeds looped with misdirection, showing empty streets where ambush teams waited. Every inch of Earth's surface became a weapon. Forests, caves, sewer systems. Humans made war from the very ground beneath them. But it wasn't their technology that terrified Zalker. It was their behavior. Dominion soldiers operated under protocols, orders, formations, calculated precision. But humans, they ran toward gunfire. They used their own blood as markers. One squad recorded a final message while surrounded, then rigged their bodies with antimatter mines and waited. When discovered, they detonated without hesitation. No plea, no hesitation. Just a silence, then light. Zalker replayed that footage over and over. The squad had time to escape. They had chosen to become a weapon, and there was no glory in their faces. Only grim duty. The willingness to sacrifice without reward. The battle at Arctic Station Sigma changed everything. VA forces approached what appeared to be a major human research hub. Intel showed weak shielding and minimal activity. It was, in theory, an easy target. But as the Dominion troops breached the perimeter, something strange happened. The air turned to static. Visors glitched. Bioreaders flatlined. And then screams. Dozens of elite soldiers collapsed from neural overload. Some tore their own helmets off, convulsing in the snow. Zalker later learned the base had been converted into an experimental facility emitting low-frequency sonic weapons, tuned specifically to alien brainwaves. It was a defense system with no bullets, no explosions, just sound, targeted, weaponized, invisible. By week 3, the campaign was no longer about subjugation. It was about survival. Human attacks had spread beyond Earth. Orbital stations near Mars went dark. A Dominion cargo cruiser near Jupiter was hijacked by human saboteurs and crashed deliberately into a fuel convoy. Communications were jammed using bursts of old Earth pop music, played on repeat. Meaningless to Dominion software, but deeply disruptive to signal algorithms. A simple, chaotic, unsolvable interference pattern. No alien race had ever fought this way. There was no central command to eliminate, no doctrine to predict. Human units acted independently, improvising in real time. They failed often, but when they failed, they adapted instantly. One day's loss became the next day's weapon. By the fourth week, Dominion soldiers began refusing assignments to Earth. Rumors spread. Stories of human ghosts moving through walls, of black-suited fighters who didn't speak, didn't sleep, and vanished without a trace. Some claimed the humans could breathe poison gas. Others said they hacked soldier implants mid-battle, making them see illusions. Zalker knew the truth. It wasn't magic. It wasn't myth. It was preparation. Earth had been studying the stars long before the galaxy noticed. They had been watching, learning, anticipating a war they hadn't started, but one they were ready to finish. He intercepted a human broadcast meant for internal use. A general's voice, raw and exhausted, spoke to his troops. "We are not here to win. We're here to make sure they regret trying. Every street, every ridge, every hallway, we make them pay for it. If they step on our soil, they bleed. If they fly in our skies, they burn. And if they kill one of us, we take 10 of them with us. That is our answer, not because we are cruel, but because we have nowhere else to go." Zalker didn't sleep that night, not because of what the general had said, but because of how the soldiers had responded. They cheered. Victory for humans was not an outcome. It was a mindset. At Lunar Grave 7, a massive Varin dreadnought descended into what was believed to be a defunct human mining crater. Surface scans showed no signs of life. But inside the crater were thousands of dormant mines, each tied to motion-activated triggers keyed to Varin energy signatures. The resulting explosion cracked the moon's outer shell. The dreadnought was torn apart. Earth's forces didn't even fire a shot. There was no negotiating with them. Not because they were unreasonable, but because they refused to be defined by fear. Every attempt at diplomacy came too late. The time to talk had passed the moment the first human ship was destroyed. Zalker watched a live feed of human rescue ships retrieving the bodies of both human and alien dead. They buried them side by side. No victory chants. No war trophies. Just flags draped over caskets. Earths and Varin's alike. Even in victory, they mourned, and that, Zalker realized, was their final weapon. They grieved their enemies. No other race in the galaxy did that. When the final orders came to regroup and initiate planetary bombardment, Zalker refused. He sent a single message to the High Command. "You have already lost. You just don't know it yet." He was branded a coward, a traitor, stripped of command. But in the days that followed, more commanders began to echo his words, and the Varin ships began to withdraw, one by one, under the cover of silence. No official surrender, no peace treaty, just quiet retreat, while Earth watched but did not pursue. It was over, and yet nothing had truly ended. The galaxy struggled to make sense of what had happened. The Varin, the most dominant military force in recorded history, had retreated, not because they were defeated in traditional sense, but because their will to fight had been broken, and the species that had done it, barely a blip on the Council's charts 5 years prior. The other empires began whispering the name of the human homeworld differently now, not with scorn, but with caution. Zalker watched it unfold from exile. He had refused his final orders, surrendered his title, and chosen silence. Yet, even in disgrace, his story traveled. What disturbed the other empires wasn't just that the humans had survived. It was how they had survived. Their strategy wasn't brute force. It wasn't superior numbers. It was a relentless capacity to endure, to adapt, to improvise, to reshape reality in ways no one expected. But more than that, it was their defiance, not reckless, not emotional, purposeful. Zalker was invited, secretly, by a fringe academic council to speak. Unofficial, off record. They wanted to understand. They needed someone who had seen the humans up close, who had studied them, fought them, lost to them. At first he refused, but eventually he relented. Not to warn them, he explained, but to confess. I thought strength was control, he told them. I thought war was a game of logic, of clean victories and tactical beauty. The humans shattered that illusion. He spoke not of their weapons, but of their hearts, of the way they carried photographs into battle, of the way they shared food even when starving, of how their dead were never numbers. They were names, faces, memories. To most species, lost with shame. To humans, it was legacy. They built themselves from it. The council had labeled humans volatile, but volatility suggested chaos. What Zalker had seen was something else, deliberate fury, a fury with structure, with direction. He told them about the hospital ship they could have destroyed, but didn't. It had entered a VA Rin kill zone to rescue wounded civilians, both human and alien. The Dominion flagged it as a target. But when scans showed human medics shielding alien children with their own bodies, the firing order was ignored. Even Dominion AI hesitated. And yet, hours later, that same ship transmitted no messages of forgiveness, no request for ceasefire. They continued the fight, but always by their own code. The empires began to panic, not because Earth wanted war, but because they didn't. That meant their actions couldn't be predicted by fear or greed, and that made them the most dangerous kind of species, one that fights not because it must, but because it chooses to when principles are threatened. New directives spread across the stars. Avoid human sectors. Limit engagements. Initiate trade where possible. Do not provoke. And above all, never invade. Despite that, human envoys appeared, not as conquerors, but as participants. They attended diplomatic summits, offered aid to disaster zones, shared medical advancements they had reverse engineered from captured tech. They did not ask for territory. They asked for recognition, a seat at the table, respect, not dominance. It was unsettling, because the humans weren't trying to rise through intimidation. They were earning it the hard way, through sacrifice, through resilience, through empathy. Zalker received a package, years later. Anonymous. Inside was a small data crystal with a message, a recording, grainy footage, time-stamped during the early war days. A human soldier, helmet off, sitting in a crater with two wounded VA Rin beside him. The soldier was singing, a slow, mournful tune. One of the VA Rin tried to speak, but couldn't. The human tore cloth from his own uniform and wrapped it around the alien's wound. Then he leaned back and continued to sing, blood soaking through his sleeves. The file ended with the human looking straight at the camera drone and saying, "Tell them we don't hate them. We just don't want to kneel." That was when Zalker finally understood what had truly changed. Every empire had assumed that strength came from superiority, better ships, more weapons, colder minds. But humanity's strength was rooted in contradiction. They felt deeply, and yet did not break. They loved and still waged war. They cried for their enemies and still stood their ground. They were fragile, mortal, filled with doubts, and still they refused to be ruled. They didn't want to conquer the stars. They just wanted to be left standing beneath them. And now, the galaxy had no choice but to let them. Trade routes shifted. Political alliances realigned. Treaties were rewritten. The empires that once dismissed Earth now assigned entire divisions to studying their culture, their art, their myths. Not because they feared another war, but because they feared what would happen if they forgot the lesson of the last one. And that lesson was simple. Never mistake kindness for weakness. Zalker, older now, scarred, sat beneath the dome on a neutral world, one of the few places left where he could walk in peace. He often watched the sky, tracking the slow approach of a human exploration vessel as it passed through the system. It never stopped, never hailed, just continued, calmly, purposefully. They weren't coming for vengeance. They weren't spreading an empire. They were looking for something bigger. And the galaxy had begun to follow, not out of fear, but out of respect. It had been years since the war with the Viren, yet the echoes of that conflict still shaped the galaxy. The scars were everywhere, on the shattered hulls of warships, in the debris fields above Earth, in the quiet spaces of council chambers where officials spoke in hushed tones about the humans. Some called it the human effect. Others, more fearful, whispered about the human paradox. But Zalker knew what it was really called: endurance. Humanity had shown the galaxy something no other species had grasped: the strength to endure without breaking, the power to refuse defeat, not just in battle, but in the soul. It was a lesson no one had been prepared for, and one they were still learning, even in the wake of peace. The VA Rin never invaded Earth again. The Dominion had retreated, licking its wounds, its pride fractured by something it couldn't quantify. The other empires saw the retreat as a necessary act, but Zalker knew the truth. The humans had forced them to ask themselves questions they'd never considered. What happens when an entire species refuses to kneel, to bend, to be ruled? What happens when the very idea of conquering them shatters, not because they're too weak to fight, but because they refuse to stop fighting, even when they know they will lose? Zalker was no longer a general. He no longer led armies or strategized campaigns. Instead, he spent his days talking with scholars, with ambassadors, with those who sought to understand what made humanity so special. But even after all that time, he still wasn't sure he had the answer. Humans had left with a question that would haunt the galaxy forever. How do you defeat a species that cannot be broken? It wasn't that humans didn't lose. They lost often. They were not invincible. They were not flawless. They made mistakes, and sometimes they paid for them with lives. Yet every failure, every setback, seemed to drive them forward with more fury. They didn't fear the end. They embraced it. And in embracing it, they always found a way to begin again. Zalker knew it wasn't about strength. It wasn't about tactics. It wasn't about technology. It was something deeper. Something the Viren, with all their superiority, had never understood. Humanity had a reason to fight beyond survival. They fought because they believed in something larger than themselves. The Council had dismissed Earth, assuming they were too small, too weak to resist the crushing power of the galaxy's empires. And yet, in the end, it wasn't their military might or their technological advances that had forced the galaxy to recognize them. It was their spirit, a spirit that transcended borders, species, and even reason. It was a spirit of species that refused to accept that they could be ruled, that they could be oppressed, that they could be anything less than their full, stubborn, beautiful selves. In time, Zalker became something of an ambassador himself. No longer an enemy, he was a voice of reason for those who would listen. He spoke not of human weakness, but of human strength, the quiet, unyielding force that made them more dangerous than any weapon. He spoke of their resilience, their ingenuity, and their capacity for unity in the face of adversity. The most powerful moment of his life came years after the war, when he stood before the newly formed Intergalactic Peace Summit. It was an event that brought together representatives from across the galaxy, species who had fought each other for millennia. The topic on the table was the future of humanity in the galactic community. The tension in the room was palpable. Many still viewed humanity as an anomaly, a species that had made far too much noise far too quickly. They wanted to know if the humans could truly coexist with the other civilizations, or if their refusal to be tamed was just the beginning of another, even more dangerous conflict. Zalker was asked to speak. He stood, silent for a moment, his presence commanding the room. When he spoke, it wasn't with the cold confidence of a military leader, but with the quiet wisdom of someone who had seen too much. I watched as the Viren, my people, attempted to crush them. I watched as we underestimated them, as we called them primitive and unworthy. But they are not primitive. They are not unworthy. They are something else entirely, Zalker began, his voice unwavering. Humanity is a paradox the galaxy has feared, he continued. They are the weakest, and yet they are the strongest. They are the most vulnerable, and yet they are the most dangerous. They are a species that can be defeated in battle and rise the next day with their heads held high. They are the embodiment of resilience, of defiance, and of spirit. The room fell into a heavy silence. Zalker's words weren't just a warning. They were a challenge. To every species, every empire, every leader sitting there, he was asking them to consider a truth that could not be ignored. Humanity wasn't something to be feared because they had the biggest weapons or the largest fleets. They were something to be feared because they could endure the worst the galaxy could throw at them and still come out fighting. They are not just survivors, Zalker concluded, his voice gaining strength. They are warriors of the soul, and that is a force no empire can conquer. The summit was tense after that speech, but in the following years, things changed. Slowly at first, small gestures of goodwill, diplomatic ties, trade routes cautiously opened. The fear, the suspicion, the uncertainty. Over time, it began to shift into something else. Respect, a grudging acknowledgement that the humans had earned their place among the stars. Zalker returned to Earth eventually, not as an enemy, but as a witness. He saw human cities, not as military targets, but as beacons of life. He saw the children, the families, the communities thriving. He saw how humanity had rebuilt, not just their world, but their relationships with the galaxy around them. And in that moment, he understood the final truth about humanity. They had not only survived the war with the VRN, they had won it, not through conquest, but through persistence, through the simple, unshakable truth that they would never, ever give up, and that, Zalker realized, was a true lesson of the humans. The galaxy had learned to fear humanity, not because of their power, but because of their spirit. The spirit that would never break, never yield, and never bow. The universe, it seemed, was not big enough to contain that kind of strength.